Just to be sure, this meeting is being recorded, as you just heard. So welcome everyone to the UMass Amherst Political Economy workshop, and most importantly, welcome Professor Patnaik. We are thrilled to have you. I'm thrilled that we are also able to see and hear you now. My name is Isabella Weber, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Economics Department. I do believe that Professor Patnaik probably does not need a long introduction for this audience, but let me just say that Professor Patnaik is a world-renowned Marxist economist and a professor emeritus from the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, and that he was also the vice chairman of the Kerala State Planning Board. He earned his Ph.D. in Oxford and joined the Cambridge Economics faculty when Cambridge Economics still stood for Cambridge Economics, left Cambridge in 1974 for India to join JNU. Amongst his most recent books are The Value of Money, and together with Utsa Patnaik, whom we had the pleasure of joining a couple of weeks ago, The Theory of Imperialism, as well as a forthcoming book, again on imperialism, which is titled Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present. Today's topic will be neoliberalism at a dead end. And without further ado, the floor will be Professor Patnaik's for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a chance for Q&A. I will ask everybody to post their name in the chat box for the Q&A, but I will announce this again when we get there. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor Patnaik. We are thrilled to listen to what we can learn from you about neoliberalism at a dead end. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. It's a pleasure to be a part of the UMass Political Economy workshop. Thank you for inviting me. I would be talking about neoliberalism at a dead end, on which Utsa and I wrote a piece in Monthly Review some time ago, and I shall be developing that particular argument. You see, the chief hallmark of contemporary globalization is the globalization of capital, above all, of finance. Now, historically, labor was not allowed to move freely from the south to the north. That means from the third world countries to the advanced capitalist countries. As a matter of fact, it still is not. Capital was juridically allowed. It was free to move from the north to the south, but it never actually did so. As a matter of fact, the bulk of the capital movements, as the economist Ragnar Nertze pointed out in an article a long time ago, was really within the advanced capital. For instance, in the entire history of the British Empire, percent of the total foreign direct investment of Britain, and as you know, Britain was the world's leading capital exporter, really came to India, which was the major colony. And the capital that came basically to supplement the international division of labor. It came to plantations, it came to export trade and so on, but minerals, but it did not come for the manufacturing sector. Therefore, historically, with labor not allowed to move from the south to the north and capital not willing to move from the north to the south, you actually had a segmentation of the world economy between the north and the south, and correspondingly, one part was the developed part and the other was the underdeveloped part. And this is something which continued for a very, very long time. What the current globalization has done is actually to break that pattern, because for the first time, you find that capital from the north is now willing to locate plants in the south, take advantage of the lower real wages that prevail in the south because the huge labor reserves that were themselves created under colonial deindustrialization of craftsmen And of course, thereby using the same technology that they would have used in the north, they actually now cater to the world market by locating their plants in many of the third world countries, many of the countries in the tropics and the semi-tropical regions of the world. Now, this has a number of implications. The first implication is that now, with the breakdown of the segmentation, the baneful consequences of the southern labor reserves are now felt by the workers in the north as well. Earlier, they were insulated from the effect of the southern labor reserves, but now they are subject to this effect, which is why you find a weakening of trade unions, and you find that the real wages in the north do not go up. As a matter of fact, Stiglitz has made a calculation according to which, if you look at the real wage of
Okay, it seems like the connection is unstable.
say that now, because of the competition of the southern workers whose wages are held in 2011 work average American male worker was in 1960. That is, of course, of the competition of the southern worker, American male work average American male was in 1960. That is, of course, because of the competition of the north to the south does not exhaust the labor reserves. There are at least two reasons for it. Firstly, you find that now, because much of the South is drawn into the neoliberal policies associated with globalization, there are no restraints on the pace of technical come structural change. Therefore, you find much higher rates of growth of labor productivity associated with any given growth rate now under the neoliberal regime than you had earlier. And since, as you know, the rate of growth of labor force is not employment is nothing else but the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. If all restraints on labor productivity growth are removed, then of course you find that for any given growth rate, employment generation
Professor Patnaik,
becomes extremely difficult. As a matter of fact, in India, 452. Yeah, yes.
Professor Patnaik, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but it seems like the connection is somewhat unstable. I mean, we would of course prefer to be able to see and hear you, but just to make sure that we can hear you, it might be worth turning off the video for a
I
moment.
turn off the video. I turn off the video. Do I?
Maybe we can hear you better in that case, I think, yes.
I'll just turn off the video. All right. Is
Yes,
that better?
I
Okay,
think it
fine.
is better. Okay, sorry for that, thank you.
Okay, no, that's fine. So the point is that that now with labor productivity growth being much faster for any given rate of growth of output, the rate of growth of employment is much lower. Secondly, what you find is that because of the fact that globalization of capital is associated with a very, very pronounced globalization of finance, this has an important implication. And that implication is that now you have globalized finance, which is facing nation states. Now, this is something which had never happened before. As a matter of fact, in 1933, Keynes wrote an article in the Yale Review called National Self-Sufficiency, in which his argument was that finance, above all, must be national. Because if finance is globalized, while the state remains a nation state, the capacity of the nation state to pursue any economic policies of its choice is really something which is uh, uh, which disappears because of the fact that if the nation state pursues any policy which is not to the liking of globalized finance, then finance just leaves that particular country en masse. Therefore, nation states willy-nilly, no matter what the political complexion of the regime that forms the government in the nation state, as long as the nation state is locked into uh, the web of globalized financial flows, then you find that it more or less pursues the same kinds of policies. And these policies are, of course, those which are dictated by globalized finance. Now, one very important implication of this is that now the nation state, which earlier supported all kinds of other producers, classes, and so on, withdraws that support and provides its support exclusively for promoting and protecting the interests of big capital, of corporate financial oligarchy in each of these countries that is integrated with globalized finance capital. Now, one very important segment from which the state withdraws its support is, of course, the segment of petty production, peasant production, fishermen, craftsmen, petty producers of all description, which is why you have a crisis of petty production that is inevitably associated with neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, and of course is something that invariably occurs in this current period of globalization. That basically means that large numbers of peasants and displaced petty producers move to the cities looking for jobs. But on the other hand, this actually swells the labor market, and therefore the labor reserves do not get used up. On the one hand, as I said, job creation is something which is restricted, and on the other hand, you find, quite apart from the natural rate of growth of the workforce, displaced peasants and artisans and petty producers move to towns in search of jobs, and that again swells the labor reserves. Therefore, the labor reserves in the south do not disappear, because of which the real wages are more or less kept at a subsistence level. And therefore, both in the north and in the south, if you take real wage levels, they hardly rise. The vector of real wages, the world economy, does not register any significant improvement. But on the other hand, the vector of labor productivity in the world economy is, of course, rising rapidly. And this is one reason why within each country, and of course globally, there is a rise in the share of economic surplus in output. You know, economic surplus is just the difference between labor productivity and the real wage rate. That is a surplus per worker. And therefore, the share of economic surplus rises in the world economy. Now, many people have been talking about the enormous increases in inequality. For instance, Piketty has written a whole book on the enormous increase in inequality. Their explanation for it has to do with neoclassical growth model, which is logically flawed anyway. But the real explanation, to my mind, is one which is associated with the fact that all over the world, while real wages do not rise, labor productivity is rising much, much more rapidly. And because of this, the share of surplus rises. Now, with the rise in the share of surplus, there is, of course, a tendency towards overproduction in the world economy. Now, this is something which Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy had argued for the United States in the 1960s, because of the fact that there again, real wages were not rising as rapidly as labor productivity under US monopoly capitalism. Now, if the share of surplus rises, that is like a shift of a unit income from the working masses to the surplus earners. Now, the surplus earners typically have a much lower propensity to consume compared, of course, to the working masses. And therefore, every such redistribution tends to give rise, for any given level of investment, to a deficiency ex ante of aggregate demand. And of course, to the extent that there is an ex-ante deficiency of aggregate demand, if that becomes exposed, then of course investment does not rise, investment falls. And therefore there is a tendency towards an overall deficiency of aggregate demand. This, of course, is an ex-ante tendency, but this ex-ante tendency typically, as Baran and Sweezy had argued for the United States, can be kept in check through state intervention in demand management. And this is where I come to the second aspect of contemporary neoliberal globalization. That basically state intervention, if the state is to generate demand, it has to increase its expenditure. If the state increases its expenditure by, let's say, $1, by taxing the workers by $1, there is no net expansion, not much net expansion in demand, because the workers more or less would be spending that dollar on their consumption, and therefore workers' consumption goes down, state expenditure rises by more or less an equivalent amount, and therefore there is no net expansion in demand. There is a net expansion in demand, and state intervention really enlarges aggregate demand only if state expenditure is financed either by taxing the surplus earners, predominantly the capitalists, who, as I said, have a very high propensity to consume, in which case, as you know, the value of the balanced budget multiplier is actually positive, and or alternatively, if it's financed by a fiscal deficit. Now, globalized finance is opposed to both these ways of financing expenditure. As a matter of fact, this has been a very important historical feature of finance capital. Even before it got globalized, finance is generally opposed to fiscal deficit. It is, of course, opposed. All capitalists will be opposed to taxing debt, but on the other hand, to a fiscal deficit. Why it is opposed to a fiscal deficit is in fact an interesting and profound question. It's a fact, but the explanation is something which really requires a fairly deep and profound look at capitalism. And the simple answer I'd like to present at this moment is that finance is opposed to a fiscal deficit because state directly intervening to expand employment and output is something which undermines the social legitimacy of capital, because it implies that now the level of activity in the capitalist economy can no longer depend on the state of confidence of the capitalists. They don't have to be cosseted, they don't have to be nurtured, they don't have to be provided incentives to stimulate their animal spirit so that they can undertake larger investment, because the state can do the same job. Therefore, it undermines the social legitimacy of capital in general, and it undermines the social legitimacy in particular of that segment of capital, namely finance, which, as Keynes had said, consists of functionless investors. Therefore, you find that in this period, even as a tendency is generated toward an ex-ante tendency is generated towards an overproduction crisis, towards a deficiency of aggregate demand, the capacity of the state, as Keynes had advocated, to overcome this ex-ante tendency is something which is undermined also by the same phenomenon of globalization, this time the globalization of finance. Now, this means that basically this ex-ante tendency towards overproduction, towards the deficiency of aggregate demand, actually shows itself or would show itself in terms of an ex-post deficiency of aggregate demand. Two factors within the system can actually offset this. One, of course, is stimulating workers' consumption through larger borrowing. Your wages are not rising, But on the other hand, if you can borrow a larger amount to maintain your consumption, then of course there need not be a deficiency of aggregate demand. But on the other hand, this obviously has its limits. Schumpeter, when he wrote his book Business Cycles, had provided an interesting concept which he called auto-deflation. That basically when the workers get more indebted, then they actually tend to cut back on their expenditures in order to pay back the debt. Or, he used it more generally for firms and so on. But the same can be used for the workers as well. And therefore, you find that this way of maintaining aggregate demand in the face of the ex-ante tendency towards its deficiency has, of course, limitations. The second is through bubbles of various kinds. In fact, this has been the main reason why world capitalism had not got into a crisis earlier, because in the 1990s, there was the dot-com bubble in the United States, largest capitalist economy in the world. There's a bubble in the United States that actually shores up the entire world capitalist system. And after the dot-com bubble collapsed, you actually had the housing bubble, which played a very similar role. As a matter of fact, many people criticize Alan Greenspan for having encouraged, as it were, the housing bubble. In some such bubbles, the system would have got into a crisis even which, as a matter of onwards, in 2008 onwards, there has been a remarkable slowing down in the growth of world capitalism. EU has had a more or less prolonged crisis. In the United States, there have been periodic revivals, but on the other hand, these revivals have also petered out fairly soon. As a matter of fact, in America, the unemployment rate, as you know, it shows is extremely low because of the fact that uh, the workforce participation rate has gone down. If you adjust for that, then you find the unemployment rate in the US even now is about 8% or so, not the 3.5 to 4% which official data show. So you find, therefore, that there is a tendency for the ex ante overproduction crisis to become an ex post overproduction crisis in the absence of bubbles of various kinds. Bubbles, as you know, push up the asset prices.
Professor Patnaik? Okay, it seems like we have lost
Asset prices artificially
Professor
because of
Patnaik.
speculation itself, because of the collapse of the bubble. Sustained growth rates is something which, on the collapse, even the obviously first time you can have a pronounced bubble, but the third time people will be much more careful, because after all, if the bubble collapses, then they are going to become bankrupt. Therefore, the euphoria that is required for sustaining a bubble in asset prices is something that would become less and less over time as people learn from the past experience, learn about the fragility of speculative bubbles, and therefore the capacity of this also to stimulate the economy to higher levels of aggregate demand tends to generally get curtailed. Therefore, in that sense, this is the sense I was saying that neoliberal capitalism has now come to a point where, on the one hand, what Keynes had thought, namely the state can intervene to save the system, no longer works. Other ways in which the system has so far managed to sustain itself, they are by their very nature transitory, like bubbles or loan sustained consumption and so on. And that being the case, neoliberal capitalism is reaching or has reached a dead end. And this is something which is visible not only in the fact that in the advanced capitalist countries after 2008, there is a general slowing down of the growth rate, a much lower growth rates than before, but that now this crisis is also beginning to affect countries like India and China, which originally appeared to have weathered the storm. And I'm talking about before the pandemic. Under the pandemic, of course, there has been a sharp collapse in the level of activity everywhere. But even before the pandemic, in India, for instance, growth rate was slowing down for the last 6 years. Similarly, even in China, the growth rate was slowing down. And these were some of the fastest growing economies of the world during the period of the bubble 2004-5. So, this tendency of world capitalism to slow down is something which basically means that under neoliberal capitalism, it reaches a dead end. By which, what I mean is that any further resumption of growth, any further reduction in unemployment, any further overcoming of the crisis requires that the hegemony of globalized finance we lose, requires overcoming the hegemony of globalized finance. Now, it is perfectly possible. Now, no, as I said, no individual nation state can possibly do this because finance is globalized, the states are nation states. But on the other hand, it's perfectly possible to have, for instance, a coordinated fiscal stimulus by large numbers of nation states, advanced country nation states coming together in order to overcome the objections of finance and to have a fiscal policy for expansion. Now, this is something, and obviously they have tried monetary policy, interest rates have been pushed down to zero, but monetary policy doesn't really work in situations like this. Therefore, monetary policy has been quite infractuous. What is required is a fiscal stimulus. And fiscal stimulus, no individual country can really provide. But on the other hand, if many countries got together, then you may be able to have a coordinated fiscal stimulus. Notice what it means. It means finance is globalized. Effectively, it would mean a coordination of fiscal policies across nation states, which would mean that effectively you have a sort of de facto, a surrogate global state. Therefore, you can overcome the opposition of global finance by having a surrogate global state with many advanced capitalist countries own particular states getting together to provide such a fiscal stimulus. This idea was put forward, by the way, in the 1930s. It was put forward by a group of German trade unions, and it was also put forward by Keynes himself, John Maynard Keynes, as a way of overcoming the depression. But of course, there were no takers for it. At the moment, while this could be a possible solution, not only there are no takers for it, even the idea is not being put forward. As a matter of fact, countries are going their own way. The United States has now basically relying on a degree of protectionism to enlarge its level of activity. Protectionism is something that can work only if others don't retaliate. But of course, if protectionism does work, that amounts to exporting unemployment. That really amounts to pursuing a beggar my neighbor policy that would necessarily make the others really retaliate against the US if, if it becomes necessary, and when it does become necessary, and they do retaliate, then of course the US boom, whatever boom they could have got, or whatever aid to the addition to globalize, to aggregate demand the US economy could have got, is something that goes away, that disappears. So, at the moment, there is no talk of a coordinated fiscal stimulus. At the same time, the alternative is to actually have countries shake off the yoke of uh, the hegemony of globalized finance, and to do so by uh, getting out of the whole process of globalization. That is delinking from globalization, and that is something which countries would have to do on their own. And this is something which, however, would require, because obviously the current regime has the support of the domestic corporate financial oligarchy. It has, of course, the support of globalized finance capital. Therefore, it has the support of all the advanced country states. Any country that wishes to delink from globalization would have to mobilize the domestic workers and peasants and so on. It has to promise them a better deal, and that would require, of course, that that such a country can no longer remain confined to the limits of capitalism. That basically, therefore, that would require going beyond capitalism. And this is something, therefore, that would really open up the way for that will open up the way for a transition towards socialism. Therefore, at the moment, it seems to me that the overcoming of the of the hegemony of globalized finance would require either a transition towards socialism, or alternatively, it would really require a coordinated surrogate global state, which is not even being talked about. Then what is being talked about? I think that's an important point that we have to look at. What is being talked about is to continue with the hegemony of globalized finance, but to do so by resorting to authoritarian fascist regimes, which then become more and more repressive. Now, there is a very fundamental difference between the fascism of the 1930s and the fascism or the authoritarian fascist regimes which are coming up today. And of course, there are large numbers of basic differences. I'm not talking about all of them. But at the economic level, there is a very basic difference, namely that in the 1930s, the fascist regime that had come up had actually enlarged employment. Japan got out of the Great Depression in 1931. Germany got out of the Great Depression in 1933. They actually enlarged government military expenditure, financed by borrowing, which finance capital had to accept because it was not globalized, it was national finance capital. Governments borrowed. These governments were fascist governments. They, in fact, enlarged their military expenditures, and in the process generated much larger employment. As a matter of fact, there was a period between their getting out of the Great Depression, but on the other hand, the unleashing of the war, which happened, let's say, around 1938-39, during which the fascist regimes actually got some popular support because they had got the countries out of unemployment and the depression, and the horrors of the war had not yet visited the people. Likewise in Japan, 1931, they got out of the depression, but on the other hand, therefore employment increased, but on the other hand, the real horrors of the war visited Japan later. So there's a brief period in which fascism really got a certain degree of popular support. But on the other hand, contemporary authoritarian fascist regimes are really quite incapable of even achieving this, because they can do so by borrowing larger government expenditure financed by borrowing. But on the other hand, such borrowing is frowned upon by finance. In a situation where finance is national, you can nonetheless control it, you can override its objections. But in a situation where finance is global, even for an authoritarian fascist regime, you cannot really overcome its objections. And as a result, you find that even the contemporary authoritarian fascist regimes are really quite incapable of enlarging employment. And therefore, to the extent that these regimes are there to provide an alternative way out of the current crisis by crushing trade unions, by crushing workers. In fact, they work in two ways. One is that they divert attention by positing the other, which is a migrant or which is a minority, which is a racial minority, or ethnic minority, or religious minority, as the other responsible for the crisis, or the Chinese, or the Mexicans, or whatever. So therefore, they change the discourse. The other way they work is, of course, through repression. Repressing the working class, repressing workers' rights, so that they believe that this would provide capital with greater animal spirits so that they can undertake investment. This is the kind of thinking that used to characterize economies before Roosevelt came up with his New Deal, characterized, for instance, US economic thinking. Now, both these, therefore, are not going to work for very long because, after all, you'd be stuck in the crisis anyway. Now, that being the case, these authoritarian fascist regimes will have to become more and more repressive over time. Now, that basically has an important implication. The implication is that the way out of the crisis, and at the same time, I mean, the way out of the crisis in terms of an economic agenda that mobilizes the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, the salariat, and so on, around an economic agenda, because they are the ones who are suffering. An economic agenda that necessarily has to go beyond neoliberal capitalism. That project then gets interlinked with the project of preserving democracy, preserving freedom of speech, freedom of expression, preserving civil liberties, and so on. We in India are really finding this very clearly, because you have a government that is simultaneously pressing against the workers and the peasants, and at the same time is also repressive in terms of subverting democratic institutions. Therefore, the struggle for democracy and the struggle for having an economic agenda that goes beyond neoliberal capitalism then tends to get linked. Now, therefore, I don't want to continue for very long, but the point is that, therefore, it seems to me that the fact that neoliberalism is at a dead end is something which has very important historic implications. In a sense, we are now witnessing a phase rather similar to what we had witnessed in the interwar period. In the interwar period, what had happened was, on the one hand, the stimulus to capitalism which had been provided by colonialism, by encroachments into colonial markets, which basically underlay the role of Britain as the leading capitalist power, that stimulus had got exhausted, and there was no new stimulus that was actually coming into being. Keynes argued that the state could provide such a stimulus. So it was between two stimuli. One had got had got exhausted, while the other had not even made an appearance. Now it seems to me that once again we are in a situation where neoliberal capitalism is really caught in in a predicament where state intervention and demand management has run its course. You cannot invoke the state intervention through fiscal means, which is the main effective means, any longer. And at the same time, no new means are obviously available on the horizon. And therefore, this is a situation, an ideal situation, where it is possible for the left and democratic and progressive forces to mobilize the people for going beyond neoliberal capitalism. At the same time, at the same time, we must not underestimate the difficulties of transition, because we now are in a world in which, as I said, the hegemony of finance capital is buttressed not only by the not only by the support of the local capitalists, the local corporate financial elite, but the entire world. I mean, major capitalist states in the world. They would immediately impose sanctions upon you. They would immediately kind of, therefore, twist the arms of such a government, which actually would bring about a reduction in the living standards of the very people who suffer the most under neoliberal capitalism, the working people. And therefore, you have a situation where the very classes upon whose support a transition can be made beyond neoliberal capitalism are the classes that are going to be hurt badly by the transition. Therefore, there are great difficulties in this transition. But it seems to me that this is the only way forward, and this is also historically an opportunity for the left and progressive forces to break from the bounds of neoliberal capitalism. I think I'm going to stop there. I believe there is some problem about audio, but I'm very sorry. I don't know what to do about it. But I think I should stop there and then take some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for a lecture that I think really helps us understand the big mess that we are in. Thank you so much. There were some connectivity issues, but as far as my computer is concerned, I clearly could follow your argument. So I think we let's just assume that everybody is roughly on board. Shall we try once more to turn on your video, or is that, maybe we can try, and if the connection gets too bad.
Shall I? Okay. I have now switched it on. Shall I keep it on or shall I turn it off?
I think it would be nice to see you for the Q&A.
All right, okay, fine.
If the connection gets too bad, we can turn it off again. How about that?
All right.
Okay, we now welcome everybody to raise questions. If you have questions, please message in the chat box and either simply put down your name or put down the full question that you would like to ask. And I can see that there is already a first question by David Kotz. So David, why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think you made a good case for the opportunity that this situation creates for the left, for those who want to move beyond capitalism. But I wonder what you think of the possibility that there will be a resolution of this crisis somewhat similar to what happened to a similar crisis after World War II, when capitalism was reformed into a social democratic form, and there followed several decades of relatively vigorous expansion. Do you think that is a possible direction? I think one has to note that a transition beyond capitalism requires a strong socialist movement based in the working class and other oppressed groups, and it's not clear that those conditions are present yet. But perhaps are there conditions that would make it possible for a shift from neoliberal to a social democratic form?
You know, post-war social democracy really, used Keynesian demand management. As a matter of fact, Keynes himself did not cut much ice in Britain in the pre-war period. In the post-war period, it was the ascendancy of labor, which had come out of the war, made great sacrifices. Winston Churchill lost, if you remember, the elections in 1945 in Britain. All over Europe, social democracy was on the ascendancy, and social democracy implemented Keynesian demand management. So the fact that the state was used as an instrument for expanding its expenditure, financing the welfare state, which was partly financed at the expense of the workers themselves, but of course to a significant extent also at the expense of the capital. Now, therefore, that was a period in which finance capital was essentially national, and finance capital had really lost, its clout during the war years. But on the other hand, now we are in a situation where finance capital is globalized. Now, there is no nation state. That's why the crisis of social democracy at present arises precisely for that reason, namely that if they go against the wishes of finance, in that case, the country gets into a financial crisis. And they do not suggest a way of coming out of the crisis by delinking from the process of globalization. Therefore, social democracy is now caught in a situation where if they adopt a social democratic program in the current moment, then they would have to activate the state, and any state activation or any activation of the state is anathema as far as globalized finance is concerned. That's the contradiction really I'm talking about. And that is why neoliberalism is at a dead end. As I said, one way could be if you actually had a surrogate global social democratic state. But that's something which is not even talked about. One of the things about the interwar period is that even before the post-war economic regime was put in place, people were talking about it. Keynes had already suggested in 1936 what can get the system out of the crisis. And I said many German trade unions had also made all kinds of it. So there was a debate about how to go beyond the current situation. But on the other hand, at the moment, even a recognition of the current situation is barely visible. And where it is, the typical answer is an authoritarian fascist one. To my mind, I have yet to come across any creative suggestion about how the capitalist world, as a capitalist world, can go beyond neoliberal capitalism and hegemony of finance.
Thank you. I have 4 more people in the stack: Vijay Kumar, Rebecca Carr, Nirmat Roy, Nichala Acharya. Excuse my terrible pronunciation. So let's start with Vijay Kumar. Vijay Kumar, would you like to pose your question? Okay, not responding. Let's move on to Rebecca Carr for now. Rebecca?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for a very illuminating and very concisely articulate lecture. I just wanted to ask you, we're facing, sort of everybody's facing environmental collapse. And I wondered how, whether this environmental collapse factors in at all, or has anything, how does it contribute to neoliberal dead ends? Or how does it contribute to an understanding of how we get out of this whole crisis without saving capitalism? My purpose is not to save capitalism from itself. The purpose, of course, is to overcome it and to move, as you say, transition into something else. But given the global environmental crisis that is popping up everywhere, I mean, floods, fires, whatever, it's hard to envision. So just a question. Thank you.
To my mind, overcoming or coping with the environmental crisis would necessarily require going beyond capitalism, which basically means that I believe that capitalism is largely responsible for the environmental crisis that is upon mankind. And nothing is being done, as you know, most capitalist countries, and certainly not the authoritarian fascist regimes, towards whom the hegemony of finance is pushing mankind, even acknowledge that there is an environmental crisis. So in a sense, the two problems, namely overcoming the environmental crisis and overcoming the crisis of the economy, the unemployment and so on, really are linked, because both would require going, making a transition beyond this phase, the hegemony of finance. And that transition, I believe, would necessarily have to be a transition towards socialism. So I did not talk about the environment because, it's, you see, when mankind is faced with multiple crises, the point is that which one hits you first. The economic crisis can be considered to be hitting you first, or the environmental crisis. Well, I presume that the economic crisis is hitting us immediately, but of course, maybe you're right that the environmental crisis would hit us before. But the point is that either would require that we go beyond the current phase of capitalism. And fundamentally, I'm arguing that one cannot go beyond the current phase of capitalism to some new possible phase of capitalism, because even capitalists are not talking about, or even bourgeois economists are not talking about some possible new phase of capitalism beyond the current phase, like, for instance, Keynes was talking about in the 1950s. Nobody who is a defender of capitalism is really projecting a picture of post-globalized finance capitalism or post-neoliberal capitalism. And so my answer would be that the two are really part of the same problem, though I have really talked about only one part, one side of it.
Thank you. Let's move on to Nirma Roy. Are you there?
Oh yeah, thank you, Professor Patnaik, for this wonderful lecture. My question is something very much contemporary in a sense. How would you locate the current finance capital's liking for the stock market? So how would that fit into the neoliberal agendas of the capitalism, and how is going to work in the future?
No, but that's precisely what finance capital does, because what finance capital does, it has no interest. Okay, what do I mean by finance capital? Keynes had drawn a distinction between enterprise and speculation. The distinction was that if I buy an asset for keeps, I buy the asset and I keep it, then that is really symptomatic of enterprise. But if I buy an asset today in order to sell it tomorrow, then that is symptomatic of speculation. Now, when finance capital comes and buys stocks, let's say on the Indian or the Polish or the Pakistani or whatever stock market, it does so not necessarily because it is at all interested in how the enterprises whose stocks it has bought are performing. But it is interested in buying the stocks today and maybe shifting to some other stocks tomorrow, maybe shifting the money out of the country tomorrow altogether. Therefore, it is essentially speculative. And this which is the speculation is essentially the hallmark of finance capital. Now, many governments, I think this is the kind of tendency you find, that many governments in the European Union and elsewhere are really now trying to make sure that really that finance does not, or speculation does not entail losses for finance. They're actually trying to put a floor to the losses that can be made through collapse of bubbles and so on, thinking that thereby they might stimulate a bubble. But on the other hand, this is something which is just about being tried, but with the degree to which this is going to, this basically means that in periods of crashes, you socialize the losses that finance capital might make. But the point is whether this is going to give rise to a new boom altogether in the real economy remains to be seen, because of the fact that, as I said, once bitten, twice shy. Therefore, once you have had a crisis of this kind, it becomes more difficult for people to put their faith in having a bubble and using the wealth effect of that bubble for enlarging their expenditures and their demand for goods.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Nichala Archaya. Are you there?
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. Can you hear me? Hello.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Professor Patnaik. One of the fundamental argument that we have been hearing from you, particularly with regard to the role of finance capital in terms of not allowing states to go for public expenditure, higher public expenditure order. So you just mentioned about there are two possibilities that states can do, probably through taxing the billionaires, and the other one is to go for borrowed finance public expenditure. So both are actually not finance capital did not allow states to go for having higher order of public expenditure, and at this pandemic time the public expenditure is more crucial to have and to revive the economic growth. So what would be your suggestion in terms of particularly the third world countries, and to expand the public provisioning? I am talking about public provisioning, not public expenditure, because public expenditure and private provisioning is happening increasingly in these third world countries. So what would be your policy suggestion for these third world countries to attack the global finance? Thank you. Sir, can you unmute, please?
Okay. Even public provisioning requires expenditure. Public expenditure is not increasing to the extent that it should. As a matter of fact, during the pandemic, you find that, say in India, in the United States or in Europe or in Britain, everybody who was unemployed, everybody who suffered because of the lockdown during the pandemic was given some finance. It didn't happen in India. That didn't happen in many third world countries. As a matter of fact, you must have seen pictures of migrant workers walking back home. They had no money. And consequently, we have been arguing for quite some time that the government must give to every household. You can say every non-income tax paying household and so on, 7,000 rupees per month for a period of at least 3 months. And the government must give to every family. Again, you can say the bottom 80% of the families that uh, 10 kilograms of food grains per person per month. And this is something which we have been asking for. The government has not given any cash assistance. Now, I believe in the current, because what happens is that during the pandemic and the lockdown, activity stops. Because activity stops, government revenue goes down. Because government revenue goes down, government expenditure goes down, because they are not willing to enlarge the fiscal deficit. While we have been arguing that this is a period the government must spend by enlarging the fiscal deficit. In fact, we have been suggesting that the fiscal deficit in India should be enlarged to as much as 15% of the GDP at the moment, and this should be borrowed from the central bank. That monetized fiscal deficit should just be expanded, because this is something that would also help in reviving demand in the economy, and certainly it will provide relief. So that which provides relief and that which is as it were, kind of anti-recessionary are all come together, and that is something which has to be done. So the government has to immediately provide relief uh, to every family, and also this is going to help in the recovery that is going to follow. Otherwise what happens is that, suppose the lockdown finishes, suppose the pandemic finishes, even when the pandemic finishes, during the pandemic, people have actually borrowed. large numbers of people who had no incomes and no support from the state have borrowed. When they have borrowed, then even after the pandemic is over, assuming that they actually manage to get some income, they would not be consuming all of it. They would actually be paying back some of their debt. And as a result, aggregate demand would be low, because of which activity would be low, because of which the recovery itself would suffer. And if the recovery suffers, then of course investment is going to suffer, and that can take the economy further and further and further down. In which case, you would not really have a recovery, but you would have a partial recovery followed by a major shift towards a recession. So we have been saying to prevent that, it's very important for the government to enlarge its expenditure and to do so by enlarging the fiscal deficit. Put money in people's hands.
Thank you. I'd like now to move on to Sunmik Pal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your thank you for your talk, Professor Patnaik. So, I mean, you were talking about like trying to think of creative possibilities to move beyond neoliberal capitalism. So, I was thinking that the monopoly of neoliberal finance is kind of predicated on the power of the state and its monopoly on violence. And so, do you like what do you think of like in the future, if you are trying to move beyond this this paradigm of neoliberal capitalism, should we not be thinking of a future where there is no state, like because capitalism, like the power of capital is predicated on the state's power itself?
Yeah, I mean, surely the idea that there would be a withering away of the state, the idea of a future without the state as an institution. I mean, obviously, there would be people, if people uh, have quarrels among themselves, you need somebody to settle the quarrel. But an institution like the state, or if you like, an institution like the state that is placed above society, is something which both the anarchists and the Marxists believe is not necessary, except the Marxists believe that this is something which can only, the state can wither away, while the anarchists believe that the state has to be smashed immediately. So the idea of the withering away of the state is something which, of course, I accept. But the point is that has to be a withering away. The point is that, that at this moment, suppose tomorrow we have a particular country that wishes to delink from globalization because it wishes to delink from the hegemony of globalized finance. Without this hegemony of without delinking from the hegemony of globalized finance, you'd never have the elbow room to have any alternative economic policy or strategy. So you require to delink from the hegemony of globalized finance. Of course, ideally, if you could have a world delinking, fine, very good. A coordinated delinking by all kind of workers everywhere and so on. But that is not immediately on the cards, because all working class peasant struggles and so on are still confined to national boundaries. If you have a delinking of that kind, then that delinking would have to be therefore followed by an alternative program, an alternative economic strategy. Now you need an agency to actually implement that program and to implement that strategy. That agency would, of course, not be a bourgeois state or a capitalist state, but that agency would derive its support from the working people, the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, and even some small capitalists, for instance, who also currently are suffering because of the hegemony of finance. So that would have to be a state with an alternative class basis, and that state itself can, over a long period of time, because even the transition to socialism will take long, and when there is a transition to socialism, the withering away of the state would actually take a very long time.
Thank you.
Thank you. let's move on to the next big question by Parthasarathi Muthukarupan. Are you there?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prabhat, Professor Prabhat. Generally, I've read some of the theoreticians of neoliberalism suggest that any collective form of people is under attack during the neoliberal ideology, whether it is any collectivities of labor unions or any such forms are forced to disappear. That's the one of the fundamentals of neoliberal ideology. So in that kind of that's the kind of suggestion. So in that context, I found your organizing certain forces to fight this global financial force as a hopeful kind of talk. Can you say a little more about the relationship between, on the one hand, there is a fascist kind of a force. On the other hand, there is a global capital, which is generally theorized and understood as objective kind of a force, whereas the fascism, which we have it in our nation states, is clearly identifiable and in fact it is ultra subjective, right? So this relationship between these two is very intriguing. Can you say a little about that?
Professor Patnaik? Oh, I think Professor Patnaik lost the connection for a moment. He seems to be joining the call back now. Let's see.
I think there was an issue, Isabella. So he joined twice.
Professor Patnaik?
I'm very sorry. I'm getting disconnected from time to time. Yeah, sorry. I'm back again. Yeah. Yes,
Could you hear the question? Could you still hear the question?
I mean, is it possible that you can read it out or something?
Yeah, please.
Could you just repose your question in a very brief fashion, please?
Professor Patnaik, can you say a bit about the relationship between supposedly the objective kind of force of global capital and in a very specific subjective kind of force of fascism in the national space? We know who are the agents of fascism, how it works. It also is very subjectively targets people, etc., right? So this relationship between
yes,
capital and fascism, could you say a little more about it?
Well, I mean, if you look at, okay, I'm more familiar with the Indian situation, but I'm sure this can be replicated elsewhere. This is being replicated elsewhere. But fundamentally, the authoritarian fascist tendency also shows itself in a very close nexus between corporate capital and the state. Kalevsky had defined fascism as a kind of, an alliance between fascist upstarts and big business. Mussolini had defined fascism as a fusion of corporate and state power. Now, when you have a small number of corporates who are very close to the personnel, the top personnel of the state, which is a hallmark of fascism, and this is something which you find in India as well, then that actually is how the impact, I mean, how capitalists directly influence state policy. Now, in India, for instance, in the very recent period, there has been an effort to curb the workers' rights. there has been an effort to make sure that corporate capital encroaches upon peasant agriculture. You know, there are 3 agriculture bills. The whole purpose of the bills was to actually make sure that now the peasants really become subjugated by corporate capital. Similarly, you have workers' rights being taken away and they're being pushed back to, as it were, a 19th century status because of, in the name of a national emergency, pandemic, and so on and so forth. Fortunately, I don't know if you have seen, yesterday the Supreme Court turned down one of the measures which the Gujarat government had taken, according to which workers would be made to work overtime, but not paid for overtime. In other words, they would just be made to work for hours and hours longer, but they would not be paid for it. So this is really a direct increase in the rate of exploitation of the workers. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court turned it down, saying that, look, an emergency, I mean, a pandemic is not the same as a national emergency in the sense that there's no security threat to the country. But the point is that, you know, that this is the kind of effort which is being made everywhere to attack the rights of workers and peasants, even as the freedom of expression of intellectuals, of artists, of civil rights activists, and so on, and of whatever political opposition remains in the country, all of that is being attacked. So this authoritarian fascism is very directly pro-capitalist.
Thank you. The next person I have on the list is Aritra Basu. Are you here?
Hi, yeah. Yeah, so my question is something like this. So while mitigating so I'm talking about the process of delinking from globalization. So while mitigating the issue of sanctions, how important do you think movements such as one for universal publicly funded healthcare is, particularly like I have seen you talking about this for a while, but like particularly in a post-COVID like kind of a scenario, how important do you think it is? And like if I add to that, do you think that, say, in the Indian context, forces that have played a significant role in the neoliberal onslaught, like, can they be thought as allies in this struggle? So I have this couple of questions for you.
Well, okay. I think, put it this way, I talked about the difficulties of transition. Now, the difficulties of transition, the whole idea, the whole effort should be minimize the difficulties of transition. I mean, have all kinds of relations with others, exploit whatever international contradictions exist in some. For instance, when Syriza came to power, instead of Syriza simply accepting the EU proposal, which was basically German finance capital dictating terms to Syriza, I believe they could have made an effort to talk to the Chinese or to talk to the Russians, who currently have some contradictions of their own vis-a-vis the kind of capitalist world leaders. Whatever. I mean, I'm not asserting that, but I'm giving that as an example. Now, in that, therefore, I believe that in building this alternative agenda for going beyond neoliberal capitalism, one of the main items could be that, let us say, we guarantee to everybody a set of fundamental economic rights. The right to food, the right to employment, failing which they should be given complete wage rate. In other words, the right to free healthcare, publicly funded healthcare along the lines of a national health service, the right to free education, quality, publicly funded education, at least up to a certain level, and the right to old age pension and disability benefits. A calculation I made for India would suggest that 7% of the GDP is what is required over and above what is being spent on many of these heads. You require 7% of GDP to be mobilized in the form of additional taxes in order to finance this kind of a program. Now, 7% of GDP you can finance just by putting 2 taxes on the top 1% of the population. A wealth tax, a 2% wealth tax, and of course an inheritance tax, which is 1/3 of what is passed down every year by the top 1% of the population. So in a period in which there has been burgeoning wealth inequality, in which there is no control on wealth inequality, there is no wealth taxation in India whatsoever, there is no inheritance taxation, simply taxing the top 1% of the population. Through these 2 taxes, you will be able to mobilize enough resources, which together with what is being already spent, would be quite enough to finance the program towards a welfare state by giving these 5 fundamental rights. Now, this is illustrative. Obviously, other people would have other ideas and so on. But my point is that it is not at all difficult to think in terms of a transitional program of that kind, and it is not at all difficult even to implement such a transitional program within a period of, say, a few years, 2, 3, 4 years. Then your other question is having relations with whoever is anti-neoliberal. Okay, not anti-fascist, but anti-neoliberal. Yeah, I mean, I think that is essential. The real interesting question, which I thought you were going to ask, is whether you should have relations with anti-fascist elements who might be neoliberal, because that is a real contradiction. Well, there I would suggest that an effort should be made to whoever is willing to agree to come on some kind of a program. And of course, to accommodate them, you may have to dilute your program a little bit, because it's very important to have a political unity against authoritarian fascism, not just here, all over the world where this tendency is emerging at this moment. So the political unity must not mean capitulating to neoliberalism, because then you are handing over to the fascists that even if you defeat them at the moment, 2 years down the line, they'll be back in power.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on to Yingchen.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Professor Patnaik, for the wonderful talk. My question is that if we are to think of an alternative model for globalization, or maybe we don't even need to call it globalization, but one that defies the logic of capital, then what kind of experiences can we borrow from, or lessons can we learn from the trade and cooperations among socialist countries during the 20th century? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I do not visualize that the transition from capitalism would necessarily have to take the form of a planned economy, in the sense that we understood planning. Not just in the Soviet Union, that in the sense that we understood planning even in many third world countries in the 50s and 60s. I believe it has, I mean, of course, you would require some planning, but on the other hand, it is something which has to be much looser than the case earlier, at least in 2 ways. First, detailed plans are not necessary. Second, it is important to have decentralization of decision making to the village level, to lower levels, which is something which I think is absolutely essential. For instance, I believe in China, the township and village enterprises play a very important role. There has to be an overall management of the economy from the top, and that you can have by controlling various levers, particularly, for instance, enlarging demand whenever there's a tendency towards recession through public expenditures. So overall macro management, together with public enterprises, together with private, some private enterprises, whoever wishes to kind of, set up, provided. The big capital, of course, would be against you. But on the other hand, many of the small capitalists, many of the petty producers would continue. An effort should be made to cooperativize them on a voluntary basis so that they can actually become economically much more viable And at the same time, the idea must be that there has to be a regional diversification, a regional dispersion of enterprises, of decision making, and of resources. I visualize such a thing. How such a thing would ultimately crystallize what would be the equilibrium form of such an arrangement, I do not want to venture at this moment. But on the other hand, that's the direction in which I'd like to move.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions on the list and 5 minutes left. So I think that should just work out fine. So the first one is by Tejendra Perali. Are you here? Okay, I don't think so. So let's move on to Shobik.
Hello, sir. Thank you for this fascinating talk. And my question is this. In your argument, one of the things which you have often mentioned is the importance of the national movement and the working class coming together to actually confront the capitalists. My question is, in this unity of the working class, even within the national movements, how do you think the identities play out? Does the identity based on caste, for example, in India, or the race based on the experience of the working class movement in America, has a role to play in not allowing the working class movements to form or further segregating it? So I would like your thoughts on that. And second, I just in continuation, sorry, I would like to hear that in that sense, would it be necessary at this point, and this might go even contradictory to your suggestion of this national movement, would it be important in that sense to give a call for the working class unity across the world? Because it might be the situation that whenever I have seen the experience of the political speeches and of Trump and everything, they trying to make it one working class of the North vis-a-vis the working class of the South, which is not the scenario. Given the inequalities which has happened also in the South, the capitalist class are more united. Like Ambani's and Bill Gates is more united today than the working class of the North and the South. So it's a 2-part question. 1, how do you see the role of identities? And 2, whether it's time now to give a call for this working class movement across the group.
Okay, thank you, Shobik. It's very nice to see you and to talk to you. Let me take your second question first. You see, when Syriza was in power in Greece, trying to put an alternative program, and German finance in particular through the EU was actually trying to thwart it. There was not, to my mind, any significant working class demonstration anywhere in Europe in support of Syriza. I mean, I think it's quite remarkable that working class solidarity at this moment across countries has receded to a point where even if a particular entity emerges in a particular country trying to defend and promote working class interests, that is not even supported by working classes around that particular country. Now, therefore, I would love it if there was an international working class solidarity and if it was an effective solidarity for intervention. But that is not the case at the moment. Now, that being the case, we really have to think in terms of bringing about a change within the country. Now, when you do that, then I come to your second question. I just like to mention 2 points here. First, that, earlier one could talk, earlier meaning say in the 50s and so on, one could actually talk about the workers' interests and the peasants' interests not necessarily being coterminous. If the peasants got higher prices of their products, then of course the government had to subsidize the workers, otherwise the workers would have to pay much higher prices for their food grains. Now you find that, as a matter of fact, the standard of living of workers and peasants get much more closely interlinked because of the fact that in the labor market, the displaced peasants go and swell the reserve army of labor, which actually lowers the workers' wages, even of organized workers. So in a sense, the condition of the peasantry and the condition of the working class gets linked. And this is becoming increasingly manifest in joint demonstrations of workers and peasants. Second, very recently, just 3-4 days ago, there were peasant demonstrations against, for instance, these bills, which the government of India has introduced, has passed for corporate takeover of Indian agriculture. In those demonstrations, you actually had agricultural laborers as well as peasants participating. Now that's a very new thing. You know, the contradiction between agricultural laborers and the peasants is well known, particularly the identity you talk about, because they belong to different castes. The agricultural laborers belong to depressed castes, while the peasants belong to intermediate castes of various kinds. And there was always a kind of contradiction. But this was one occasion in which the agricultural laborers joined together with peasants to protest against the government's bills. Now, I'm not saying the caste contradictions have disappeared, but I'm saying that these are possibilities which we have to take advantage of. These are possibilities which really cheer me up in terms of the future.
Thank you so much. We have one last question, Tichandra, and please briefly, since time is up, but I'd like to still give you the opportunity to ask.
Yeah, thanks very much, Isabella. I'm so sorry I had to step out previously. Professor Patnaik, really interesting to hear, quite refreshing, to be honest. I had a question relating to the nexus between neoliberalism and violent conflict. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Maoist insurgency in India and how authoritarianism, violent conflict, and neoliberalism intersect. And what are the implications for Adivasi Janjati and poor laborers and low caste groups?
Well, you know, neoliberalism, I talked about neoliberalism being against the petty producers and so on. It unleashes a process of primitive accumulation of capital. This primitive accumulation of capital takes the form of dispossessing peasants from their lands. It takes the form, above all, of dispossessing the tribal population from whatever rights that they enjoyed on, of various kinds, on land, on forest produce, and so on. Now, mineral exploitation, for instance, by multinationals now takes the form of taking over land over which the tribal population had traditional access, and that's a form of primitive accumulation of capital. Now, I think the Maoist insurgency is really, in some sense, a reflection of the opposition to this process of primitive accumulation of capital. And I think attacking that primitive accumulation of capital has to be part of any agenda that has to be now framed for going beyond neoliberal capitalism. Only in that sense that you would actually be able to incorporate that opposition into a broader opposition.
Thank you very much. That was really, really nice. Yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for joining us. I have the impression as if we just lost you again at this moment. But let me say that I think that your presentation and this illuminating Q&A really helped us to understand the origins of the current crisis, the contours of this dead end that we have reached, and also has shed light on some of the possibilities for transition. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was really terrific and extremely helpful. I would also like to announce that the next political economy workshop will be on the 13th of October with Laura Carvalho, who will be talking on multidimensional inequalities in Brazil in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And I have posted the link to the Eventbrite for this next workshop in the chat. So if you'd like to join us again, please register on Eventbrite. Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for joining us today. And I would also like to thank our two student assistants, Pedro and Deba Manu, who have been doing a terrific job in the background, helping us to make the meeting happen and have this all go smoothly despite the technical difficulties that we have encountered. Thank you everybody for joining, and I hope to see you at the next Political Economy workshop on the 13th of October.
I'm back.
You're back. Oh, wonderful. Would you still like to say a last word? Any concluding remarks?
No, I mean, you know, I would have liked to have taken many more questions, and also it's a pity that the connection was so bad. But if there are any questions people would like to ask me, then I can respond through email. So if you can give them my email address, then I can respond through email.
Wonderful, thank you so much. In this case, I would forward your email address to our registered participants.
Right.
Okay, great. Did you also hear my note of thank you to you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
I hope you didn't miss that part. So let me just reiterate, thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for joining us today. It's really been a great honor to have you. And I think that you have really helped us to understand the origins of the dead end that we have reached, as well as the precise structures of this dead end, and also pointed out some possibilities for transition. So I think this has been an extremely illuminating 1.5 hours. So thank you so much. It's been a great honor and great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Isabella. Thank you to all participants. It's a real pleasure giving this talk and also the questions and answers. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Goodbye.